So I am Ross Foard, and I do work for CISA at the CDM program. I know many of you in the room, and many of you I've worked together with for over a decade. It's really great to see so many people that we are working together. I'll do a little bit of background, and then Cathy and I will talk about the future too. Cathy?
Yeah, I'm Cathy Hall. As Jeff already mentioned, I'm a privileged access management practice lead. But in the context of CDM, I've actually supported the CDM program with my friends at CGI for a number of years, pretty much from the beginning. So I was one of the main architects for the CRED management task order, and have been supporting them in Defend as well.
And Cathy, Cathy recently, her company and Ernst & Young joined forces together, and I'm happy to see Ernst & Young as a panelist sponsor here, and I think it's an indication of how identity is growing in importance overall, as many of the speakers have talked today. I want to thank Jeff and I want to thank Jim for having us here. You've been great supporters of the program, and there's a lot more to do in the future, as we'll talk about. We're going to talk about today how CDM and FICAM converge. And I want to say as a background that when I joined CDM, a lot of work from the Federal ICAM steering committee had preceded my joining this organization, right? And it was clear to me that if CDM was going to be successful, it was going to be by working with FICAM and the FICAM goals and guidance, and supporting them in order to be successful across the entire ecosystem. So a little bit of review. Most of you probably know something about this, but I'll go into it in a little bit of detail. Continuous diagnostics and mitigation. It is the hallmark of that system is a dashboard that's on the outside layer here. And then it's a little bit hard to see. The next layer of that is assets, right? And we in the first phase, we called that phase one, we did asset management, and that was hardware assets, software assets, just taking an inventory of all the things in the environment. The next layer is around identity and access management. We called that phase two, and we're in the middle of completing phase two right now. And most of your agencies are in the midst of doing that right now. We awarded Defend contracts, which is a long-term contract to a number of integrators. And the next parts that we're trying to address are network security management. And you'll see in the middle there is data protection management. The reason data protection is in the middle is you have to have a lot of things to supporting data protection, right? You need to have many things in place before you can actually say, okay, now I can build policies that help support this data. One of the things that CDM has recently started to apply is a threat-based approach to how we determine how to do these different parts of network security management and what additional parts of identity management we need to do, and how we're going to protect data. And we were lucky to have a capability that was pioneered at DoD. It's a threat-based approach, and at DoD it was called NASCAR, and we've adopted that in the federal civilian government as GovCar. And it's a cybersecurity architecture review. So you see from this diagram here, we look at it. They do this through spins. There are periods of time that they say we're going to look at the architecture from this perspective, and we're going to try to figure out what are the critical components that in the architecture that can thwart a threat that we're seeing. They identify what mitigations that we can put in place, and it's through the identification of mitigations and prioritization of how many threats that mitigation can help with, that we can build a prioritization for what kind of capabilities we can provide through CDM for the next period. So you'll see here that CDM works really closely with the GovHeart program to use the analysis that comes out of that program and prioritize the next capabilities that we'll be introducing. So Cathy has been on this program just about as long as I have in supporting us through through the task orders that we do through integrators. And by the way, I want to thank all of the integrators and the vendors in this room, because CDM can't do anything except through the integrators. The integrators are the ones that bring us the vendors and tell us they have the right technology to meet the requirements that we give to them. And Cathy is a great example of how we work together. We had specified a master user record, and Cathy is going to tell how we actually elaborated on that to come up with the master user record at CDM.
Yeah, as Ross mentioned, the big outer circle for CDM is really about the dashboard and then reporting information up to this dashboard. But the phase 2, or the identity access management pieces of this program, are about building this master user record, or as SailPoint likes to call it, identity cubes. This is about trying to get a sense of who is on your network. I know that everybody talks about the basics. This is really the basics of who are the people on your network, and are they supposed to be there at all? So there was a number of functional areas that were defined, and I'm going to talk about them in the order of sort of a user onboarding within your organization. So of course there's the user, that one thing about that particular person, everything about them, why they need to be there, but then also what's important, and not officially part of CDM, but really important in rolling out Identity IQ at any organization, whether it's commercial or federal, is all of the access that they have as well. So not only who's on your network, but what they have access to on your network. Then, of course, trust. Before you allow anybody onto your network within federal agencies, as we all know, our onboarding processes can take a while and are somewhat complex, but they almost always start with some level of suitability, some level of trust. Did that person go through a NAC? Did they go through a NAC guy? Do we have a system of record that tells us that this person has successfully gone through a suitability check to be on the network? And then the next one is a credential. So once we know that this person is trusted, and once we know that they can support our organization, we issue them a credential. That credential, because of CDM, we want to make sure that it's a strong credential. We want to make sure that it is in the form of a PIV card or a CAT card and has some level of encryption built into it, hopefully a higher level of encryption. But that is established, and then we pull that information from the system of record that grants that PIV card or CAT card, say. And as you can see, the arrow going from cred to trust is saying that in order to get a cred, you of course have to have a trust. We will not issue you a PIV card unless we know for sure that you've met our level of suitability to be on the network. The third component of a user that we wanted to get into this master user record is privilege, right? So your PIV card will give you access to your laptop and give you access to the unprivileged systems that every user has. Your hopefully time card, as Dana mentioned, your email, those types of things, it's relatively simple to get, and we give it to every user. But are there also privileges that you need to have in your day-to-day accounts so that you can do your job? So if you're a system administrator, do you have system administrative privileges to a certain segment of your network? If you're a application owner, do you have access to the data that application owns? And if so, then what is it about you that has it? And then we also have to make sure that you have been issued a credential that meets the needs for getting that priv. So you can see that there's a requires, if you have a priv, you absolutely have to have a credential. And then the fourth component is also critical, and it's more of an ongoing thing. So a lot of these things are issued when you need them. When we talk about behave, this is, do you know what you need to do your job? Do you know what is important to, for your job day to day that will make that job more secure? So the first level of behave is, have you taken your annual CSAT, Cybersecurity Awareness Training? But in addition to that, if you have a number of privileges, do you also have the requisite training, and are you continually taking that requisite training in order to keep those privileges on your accounts? So if I am a system administrator, or if I have access to particular records, am I taking my records management training? Am I taking my system administrator training? Am I taking all of those trainings on an ongoing basis to ensure that I continue to have the access that I have? And that's really kind of the factors of the master user record that we're trying to pull in. As many of you already have pretty mature Identity IQ implementation, these would be considered your authoritative sources. These are not really, we're not pulling in access and accounts and entitlements that we would be governing in an IAQ solution. This is more around what about this user tells us that they should have access, and what is it that we can use to provide additional context into access granting decisions later.
And so, as we go forward, and these are foundational elements, these elements of trust, behave, cred, and priv, they will continue to evolve. There will be more people we need to manage. Currently, right now, CDM is concerned with employees and contractors who relate to the policy that is already on the books about who gets access to what and the things you have to do, right? The behave characteristic, we knew that right now, cybersecurity, annual cybersecurity training is kind of the table stakes that agencies are adjudicated against to make sure they're taking some kind of effort to make sure their people understand their responsibilities around cybersecurity. But we won't stop with these basic capabilities, and agencies through FICAM are already moving beyond what we've asked to provide through CDM, some of them. It kind of depends on their maturity, right? OMB issued a memo in 1917 about modernizing ICAM, and CDM is a great supporter of this modernization. Even during the phase 2 activities, we had a number of agencies ask CDM, you know, you're providing us this ability to give you information that we can then kind of assess risk, but we actually need to manage the life cycle of our users. Can you help us with that? And we adjudicated that we could do that. And for the agency that asked us under the phase 2 activities, we helped them acquire a lifecycle management tool so they could do things to manage the life cycle of the identities instead of simply the life cycle of the credentials. And that is critically important to managing and to getting to the points that we just talked about on the last slide about, you know, taking an active view of the identity as they move through the environment. And through AI, we'll have a much more active role. We're kind of doing table stakes right now, guys. We're not at that point. So some of the things that we did currently and we need to modernize on is right now the adjudication in the master user record around cred is an LOA4 credential, right? Because that's what the policies say. But with the emergence of this policy, we need to use 863. There's other types of users that need to interact with the agency's environments through FICAM, and we intend to help agencies as they do pilots and they try to work with OMB and OPM to figure out what other kind of authenticators and what other use cases they need to support into FICAM. CDM can help them if they come and ask us for that assistance. And you know, it's this evaluation of all these options and authenticators and enabling federation. We haven't done any access federation right now under CDM, but it may be that a couple of agencies, and I've talked to a few, that they may want to start doing some pilots that we can help them with perhaps in that area. That's one of the things that CDM does, is we can help agencies be first movers into areas. CDM can help people reduce their risk by doing those things. So why don't you talk a little bit about lifecycle management and privileged access management?
Yeah, so again, as part of the initial phases of CDM, a lot of the implementation of the master user record was read-only. We were pulling in all this information, trying to get it to be more accurate. A lot of times you guys were trying to get all of this data to feed the metrics up to the dashboard, but it was more manual. What we were trying to do is pull this information and refresh it every 24 hours or worst case scenario, every 72 hours to make sure that the data that was being fed to these dashboards was as accurate as possible. But again, read only. We were pulling from these systems and then feeding data up to the dashboard. As part of Defend, there's been an additional set of scope that has been added to some of these gap fill RFSs that allow us to act upon the data as we're reading it in. This is sort of something that the agencies have been asking for themselves as we were going through the phase 2 pieces of CDM. So they were saying, great, I now know that this person's suitability check has expired, or I know that their PIV card has expired, and I want to remove the access that they have today, or that they didn't take their CSAT on time. And I want to remove that access and grant it back to them once they're done. That granting and removal of access requires an additional license in SailPoint, and it requires a number of implementation configurations that have to be set. So that's all part of what we're going to be able to do as part of Defend, and have been working with different agencies to do.
Can you give them a little bit of an idea how people come into the environment? So what have you seen when you've seen agencies that have implemented ILM? What kind of activity have you seen?
One is really the automation of that onboarding event. It's a pretty long event when it comes to these federal agencies. It can take a little bit of time to get people through suitability, get them through the PIV cards. Some agencies grant you access and grant you a laptop and allow you to use user ID and password for a short period of time until that PIV card is issued, and others don't. So that automation of those different decision and processes that you have, we've helped a lot of different agencies do as part of Defend. Some of them have realized that some of the gaps we found as part of cred management is that some agencies don't own those authoritative systems that they're using to determine whether or not they should grant somebody access. So USAID is relying on a number of systems from other agencies, shared systems like and other organizations are doing the same. US Access provides a shared system for people to issue PIV cards. So getting that connection to be automated and then granting the AD account access and provisioning the PIV card information, the UPN or the alt security identities into that AD account to grant them that access immediately as soon as the PIV card is issued is something that a lot of agencies are moving on.
You mentioned some things that when people move around in the organization, that's an important thing to begin to capture in your historical information in SailPoint. And when people leave the organization, right, it's critically important to know that they're gone. And this has been a real challenge for organizations. You know, we've heard reports about people having PIV cards even when they're no longer around. So this will help people understand, that life cycle of those users as they move through. And I'll say that where we are in the implementation, most of the Defend groups, that's how we award these task orders, most of the Defend groups have ILM and PAM awards for this capability. They're in different phases of implementation, and it depends on the agency's readiness as to whether they're going to be able to help you with implementing ILM in your organization.
Another point to that, you mentioned federation, and we have a number of agencies that we worked with as part of Defend that have a very federated model, and some of the components or the bureaus struggle to offboard people because they don't have direct connectivity to that central user repository that says that person has left the organization. So a lot of times people are left within the components or within the bureaus with access for much longer than they should because they've left the organization, but that component or bureau has never been notified.
Thanks. So, do you want to talk a little bit about just what the basic architecture looks like for?
Yeah. Another part of Defend and the additional scope that's part of Defend that was not part of our cred management program is that integration of privilege access management with IGA. Again, there were two programs that were part of the initial implementation of the IAM phase. One which focused really on all users and their non-privileged access, and another one that focused on rolling out a privilege access management tool and enforcing certain policies when people need to use their privilege access. But now, as part of Defend, we're focusing more on integrating those two together and governing PAM. PAM solutions are great, and they're providing new capabilities around just-in-time privilege access management and granting a privilege access only when somebody needs it for a specific transaction. But they don't provide a good overall visibility into who has privilege access and what that privilege access looks like. When I go into a PAM tool and I use it to get to a Unix box with root access, I don't know that I have root access, and the PAM tool doesn't really care that I have root access or not root access. It just grants me that access to that system that I have an account on. When you connect to that PAM tool into an IGA tool like IIQ, you actually are given that holistic view of all the access that a user has. You're able to correlate it back, especially when it's a shared account, you're able to correlate that privileged shared account back to an individual user saying that this person has root access to these 10 boxes because they have a shared account that has root access to these 10 boxes. All together in one kind of pane, and then with the additional features of AI as we're talking about, it gives you even more visibility into what these people should be doing with the access that they have. So this ability to integrate a PAM tool with an IGA tool is a pretty powerful set of capabilities that we're looking forward to helping with.
This is one way that CDM really can help the FICAM desires and goals, because I'll probably measure some privileged users, most highly impacting privileged users, but there's a lot of other privileged users that agencies have that it's never going to be CDMs. We're not going to want to know about all those different things, right? Agencies are going to want to manage a lot of the privileges that their organizations do, and it's appropriate for you to have more knowledge of what's in your governance tool than it is for CDM to have to know all those capabilities at this point in time, right? Maybe when we get to some AI later on, we may be able to take a more holistic view of that, but currently it's these infrastructure impacting administrators that we're most interested in making sure that they have trust, cred, and behave accurately managed. So I want to segue now into a little bit to the future. We talked about how GovCar helps drive us to address threats in the environment. It's really wonderful that at the same time we needed to take a threat-based approach to identity and access management, CDM, that zero trust architectures had become talked about and prevalent in the environment. It's something that I've been watching for a number of years, and I'm really happy that the industry is kind of converging on this model, because I think it's the right model to look at for providing privilege access to any application or any users in your environment. The key elements, and the ones that CDM has supported from the beginning, is all systems are enterprise, or all enterprise systems are resources. You have to consider all the resources in your environment. And you need to take an enterprise view of all of that, right? These silos might have been something that you could build on when you were trying to make localized security control measures. But as you're trying to protect the entire environment, you need to understand the context of every user across the entire environment, because it's an aggregation of privileges, as Damon talked earlier, that you get a lot of the risk in your environment, right? So you need to make sure that communication is done in a secure manner, regardless of the network location. So, that means securing access to all your systems and resources, and a lot more focus on application access control, right? User authentication is dynamic and strictly enforced before you give access, and that means making sure that the network path that you're allowing people into the environment, as well as the users and the devices, have a context too, right? If you let somebody on with a vulnerable device, they may do things on your network that you don't intend for them to do, and they didn't intend to do, because they have the vulnerabilities on their devices. And it should be policy-based, right? So you can observe what policies are in your environment, and you can make judgments over where the localized risk is being done properly. Cathy, maybe you can talk a little bit about, because you lead the zero trust efforts in your organization. Maybe you can talk a little bit how you view zero trust.
Yeah, so the diagram here is from the NIST publication on zero trust, and while they take kind of a very holistic view of this, we are at an identity conference. So what does this mean for us in the identity space? We do have to look at zero trust across all of the different planes. We have to look at the network, we have to look at the data, we have to look at the applications and the users. But of course, we obviously care quite a bit about that last piece. So what I like to say is, for us, zero trust is really about bringing the policy enforcement decision, the policies around authentication and authorization, and additional context that you can provide to those decisions closer and closer and closer to the transaction, right? So of course, before we used to have you log onto the network, you would authenticate yourself, and then whatever you had access to using that particular login, you would just be granted at that time, all the time, in perpetuity. Now, what we're trying to do is get rid of that intrinsic trust that's built into every decision that you make. We want to be able to say, if I am going to get to my email, great, then that's a relatively simple thing for me to do. But if I'm going into a database and I'm dropping hundreds of tables, is that something that I should be doing at that particular time, even if I do happen to have vaulted access to that table that allows me to drop those tables at that time? So every transaction that we're trying to do, we want to focus on kind of the high-valued, high-privileged transactions first, but every transaction that I do as an employee of this organization should be checked at some level to make sure that not only am I who I say I am, I do and have been granted the access to do this, but also that I should be doing this at this particular time. So that is really, in order to do that, then you really need more and more information about the user, what they have access to, who granted them that access, why they should have that access. And that's kind of what CDM and FICAM have been helping us gather in one central place to allow those types of centralized decisions at any given time. One of the things that we will add onto it as we go is additional context to these types of decisions, right? So if I'm dropping a number of tables, is there also a security now ticket, a service now ticket that allows me to know that there's maybe a maintenance window that says I should actually be dropping those, or that that application is getting retired and we're actually dropping these tables in an improved manner.
Thanks. And it's about it's about context. So these are some of the steps to achieve. I'm going to go through this because I want to talk about high value assets. I'm going to talk about the context that when you go to apply zero trust, it's probably a good idea to do this purposefully, right? And CDM, when we started out with the phases 1 and 2, we tried to cover the entire environment of assets, the entire environment of human assets that are employees and contractors, as I said, right? But as we go forward, we're going to want to be more targeted on the way we apply controls, and the CDM helps measure risk in the environments. It reminded me when Daryl was talking this morning, it reminded me about how I learned about security. I was a submariner in 1980. That tells you how old I was, right? When you came onto the submarine, they had segmentation of the rights you could have. You had training. I had behaved part. I had to go through 2 years of training before I could even get on a submarine, right? And then they went through a vetting process that said that, if you're a nuclear qualified guy, you can go on the back. And you're not a nuclear qualified guy, you had to stay on the front of the submarine. And so those are those separations of duties, right? And there were controls around doing this. And then we determined what were our critical assets. And if I was going to work on a critical asset like the nuclear power plant or some control systems, there was a 2-man rule that we had to do. I couldn't just do work by myself. And there was a senior officer, and sometimes it was the commanding officer of that ship that had to approve my access to me to go do that job. And those kind of conditional controls for high value assets are the kind of things that we're trying to get to with zero trust, to make those risk-based decisions. And it's one of the reasons that it resonates so well with me. As part of agencies' strategic vision and reducing risk, they have a binding operational directive of securing their HVAs, and CDM wants to be part of helping them with that. And in the ICAM world, if you have an HVA that has risks associated with authentication or access control, we want to help to mitigate that, right? And those mitigations will end up being kind of tenets that we can leverage in other ways, or as we move into this risk-based access control and risk-based control model in the environment in general. And I think I want to save a couple of minutes, and we have 2 minutes for questions. So does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir. All right, Jim's going to bring you the thing. Gotta wait.
See, I knew I should have sat by you as soon as you opened it up for questions.
There we go.
Thank you. I formerly worked with an agency under DoD, and being that they have so many unique legacy systems, what are the challenges that you all found dealing with these different systems?
Doing the implementation of CDM? Well, look, let me say in the first place, we work really closely with DoD too, right? We view the infrastructures, although they're different, the mission approaches we're trying to take are similar in a lot of ways, and particularly in the manner to do the enterprise approach. And that has been a large challenge, right? Taking an enterprise view of your users is hard. And we were lucky in the civilian governments because those enterprises are they're more small, right? Even though organizations like DHS are big, they're not as large as the approaches that DoD has. And then they're going to have their own methods they're going to have to do about addressing the scale that they have. And I work with them. We try to share our vision and what we do. They have some advantages too, right? They have some massive stores of information already that's available for them, and they use quite often. So they have some other challenges, but they also have some other advantages, and it's really exciting time for us all to work together. So we're trying to accomplish these same goals.
Are you talking about connectivity to these systems, or just identifying them and categorizing them as
All the above.
All the above,
yeah.
exactly.
So once they were identified, that's kind of where my role came in, and we were trying to connect to them and pull data from these things. Really, the reason I think SailPoint was picked as a tool that was used across the board is because it does come with a number of out-of-box connectors that allowed us to connect to a lot of even legacy systems. We can connect to mainframes using the out-of-box connectors. If we identified a system that we couldn't connect to with an out-of-box connector, we also then checked to see if there were any, they didn't even have to be modern APIs, just an API at all that we could use to pull that data in. And you can write, there's a really easy framework within SailPoint to allow you to write custom connectors to pull that data as well. And then there are flexible connectors. There are web service connectors that allow us to pull that data. There are JDBC connectors that allow us to pull data directly from databases or views. And then kind of the last hurrah of almost every integration was, can you automate a report of this data that we can put into a flat file and then ingest every 72 hours or so?
And there is every manner of type of access, of information being flowing from manual information to automated information right now, even with the CDM implementations. Every agency is a different place in what they can provide automatic, right? And sometimes it's quite onerous on an agency to provide manual data to us, right?
And sometimes it's not the technology or the connectivity that's the problem. Sometimes it's about what data it is that we're about to pull. So we had to pull suitability information that's usually set in a legal system that doesn't have a lot of APIs, does not have a lot of connectivity, and has a lot of legal controls around who can access this very sensitive data. And then additionally, doesn't have great unique ID values. So there's a lot of complexity in the governance around and actually getting that data into these systems and then using that to feed information about each individual user. So there's connectivity discussions, there's legality discussions, there's privacy discussions, there's a number of discussions that have to happen to make this successful.
Thank you, Cathy, and thank you all.